The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine hallways of Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. General Marcus Wright strode through the corridors with purpose, his polished boots clicking against the marble floors. At 52, he commanded respect wherever he went, his chest adorned with ribbons that told stories of campaigns across 3 continents. Today was different, though. Today marked the beginning of his final inspection tour before retirement. And something gnawed at his conscience. For 28 years, he had walked these same halls, passing the same faces, acknowledging the same salutes. But there was one man he had never truly noticed until recently. An elderly janitor, who seemed to blend into the background like a shadow. The old man appeared to be in his 70s, with weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. His silver hair was always neatly combed, and despite his humble position, he carried himself with an unusual dignity. General Wright had started observing him over the past few weeks, intrigued by something he couldn't quite place. What caught the general's attention wasn't just the man's meticulous work ethic or the way younger airmen seemed to naturally gravitate toward him for advice. It was something deeper. A quality in his eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond mopping floors and emptying trash cans. There was a sharpness there, a watchfulness that reminded Wright of his own combat veterans. The janitor's name was Harold Mitchell, according to his employee records. He had been working at the base for nearly 15 years, arriving each morning at 5 a.m. and leaving precisely at 2 p.m. Never missed a day. Never complained. Never caused trouble. But General Wright suspected there was much more to Harold's story than what appeared in his personnel file. On this particular morning, Wright found himself deliberately timing his walk to coincide with Harold's routine. He discovered the old man in the memorial hall, carefully polishing the brass nameplate of a fallen pilot. The reverence with which Harold handled each memorial struck Wright as profoundly personal, as if he understood the weight of each name etched in metal. "Good morning," Wright said, his voice echoing in the quiet hall. Harold looked up, straightening slightly but not seeming startled. "Good morning, General," he replied, with a respectful nod. His voice carried a gravelly quality that suggested years of giving orders, though Wright couldn't be sure. "You take good care of this place," Wright observed, gesturing toward the immaculate memorial wall. "These men deserve nothing less, sir," Harold responded simply, returning to his work. There was something in the way Harold said, "these men," that made Wright pause. It wasn't the detached respect of a civilian employee, detached respect, but the intimate understanding of someone who had shared their risks, their fears, their brotherhood. Over the following days, Wright found himself seeking out these brief encounters. He learned that Harold had an encyclopedic knowledge of military aircraft, could identify the sound of different jets by their engines alone, and possessed an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns that often proved more accurate than the meteorology department. The breakthrough came during a casual conversation about the F-16 Fighting Falcon display in the base museum. Harold had been adjusting the information placard when Wright approached. "Beautiful aircraft," Wright commented. Harold's eyes lit up in a way Wright had never seen before. "She certainly is, sir. Responsive, reliable, and deadly when she needs to be. Like flying a scalpel through the sky." The specificity of Harold's description raised Wright's eyebrows. "You sound like you know her personally." Harold caught himself, the light in his eyes dimming as quickly as it had appeared. "Just read a lot about aviation, General. Always been interested in how things fly." But Wright wasn't convinced. The way Harold had described the aircraft suggested intimate familiarity, not academic interest. That evening, Wright found himself in his office long after hours, staring at Harold's personnel file. The document was surprisingly thin for someone who had worked on the base for 15 years. Harold Mitchell, born 1953 inches, Nebraska. High school education. Previous employment listed as various maintenance positions. No military service record on file. Emergency contact listed as none. The file raised more questions than it answered. Wright's curiosity deepened when he discovered that Harold had applied for the janitor position on the same day that Congress had passed legislation. providing enhanced benefits for classified military personnel transitioning to civilian life. The timing seemed more than coincidental. The next morning, Wright arrived at the base earlier than usual, hoping to observe Harold's routine more closely. He found the old man in the hangar, where several vintage aircraft were stored for historical preservation. Harold was standing before a restored F-16, and Wright could see his lips moving silently, as if he were speaking to an old friend. From his concealed position, Wright watched as Harold performed his cleaning duties with mechanical precision, but his eyes never left the aircraft. There was longing in his gaze, a deep sadness that spoke of separation from something beloved. It was the look Wright had seen in the eyes of retired pilots who could no longer fly. When Harold finished his work and moved toward the exit, Wright stepped into view. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Wright said, nodding toward the F-16. Harold stopped, turning slowly. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped, and Wright glimpsed something raw and powerful beneath the surface. "Yes, sir, she is," Harold replied quietly. Wright decided to push a little further. "Ever wonder what it would be like to take her up?" Harold's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his cleaning cart. "I imagine it would be something beyond words, General." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a maintenance crew, but Wright filed away Harold's reaction. There was definitely more to this man's story, and Wright was becoming determined to uncover it. That afternoon, Wright made a decision that would change both their lives. He called his old friend Colonel Sarah Chen, who worked in military records and had access to classified databases that Wright's current position didn't allow him to search. "Sarah, I need a favor," he said when she answered. "I need you to run a deep background check on someone. Harold Mitchell, currently employed as a janitor at Peterson. Something tells me there's more to his story than what's in his civilian file." "What makes you think so?" Chen asked. Wright paused, trying to articulate his instincts. "It's hard to explain. The way he moves, the way he talks about aircraft, the way he carries himself. He reminds me of pilots I've served with, but there's no record of military service." "I'll see what I can find," Chen promised. "But Marcus, if this guy has a classified background, there might be good reasons why his records are sealed." "I understand," Wright replied, "but I've got a feeling this is important." As Wright hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the sense that he was on the verge of uncovering something significant. Harold Mitchell was no ordinary janitor, and Wright suspected that beneath his humble exterior lay the story of a warrior whose service to his country had been deliberately erased from official records. The question was, what had Harold done that required such secrecy? And why was he now spending his days cleaning the very halls where he might once have walked as a hero? Wright knew he wouldn't rest until he had answers. Something told him that Harold's story was exactly the kind of tale that needed to be preserved, honored, and remembered, regardless of whatever classification had buried it in the shadows of official silence. The old janitor had secrets, and General Wright was determined to uncover them before his own retirement pulled him away from this mystery. Little did he know that the truth would be far more extraordinary than anything he could imagine. 3 days later, Colonel Chen called Wright back with information that made his blood run cold. "Marcus, you need to sit down for this." Chen's voice was unusually serious over the secure line. "Harold Mitchell doesn't exist. At least, not the Harold Mitchell working at your base." Wright felt his world shift. "What do you mean he doesn't exist?" "The Social Security number belongs to a Harold Mitchell who died in a car accident in 1995. Someone created a very sophisticated identity, complete with employment history and references. Whoever your janitor really is, he's been living under a dead man's name for nearly 30 years. Wright's mind raced. "Did you find anything about his real identity?" "That's where it gets interesting," Chen continued. "I ran facial recognition through classified databases and got a hit that required clearance levels I don't even have. All I can tell you is that the file is marked with code classifications that suggest top-secret aviation programs from the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. "What kind of programs?" The kind that officially never existed, Marcus. Black ops, experimental aircraft, missions that would be denied by every level of government. Your janitor was involved in something so classified that his entire identity was scrubbed from existence. Wright sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. Harold wasn't just a former military man. He was a ghost. Someone whose service had been so sensitive that he had been forced to become someone else entirely. There's more, Chen added. I found a notation in the system. Someone with very high clearance has been monitoring queries about this individual. My search probably triggered alerts somewhere in Washington. Jesus, Sarah. What have I stumbled into? I don't know. But Marcus, be careful. People don't disappear this thoroughly, unless they've done things that powerful people want to forget. After ending the call, Wright sat in his office for hours, staring at Harold's fake personnel file. The man he had been casually conversing with for weeks was a phantom, someone who had sacrificed his very identity for his country. The question that haunted Wright was why someone with Harold's obviously extensive background was content to push a mop and empty trash cans. The next morning, Wright arrived at the base with a new perspective. Every interaction with Harold now carried weight. Knowing that beneath the humble janitor exterior was a man whose true story was locked away in the deepest vaults of national security. He found Harold in the pilot briefing room, methodically cleaning the chairs where young aviators received their mission assignments. Wright watched as Harold paused at the podium, running his weathered fingers across the surface with the familiarity of someone who had stood there before. Harold, Wright called softly. The old man turned, and Wright saw something different in his eyes. A wariness that hadn't been there before. Harold had somehow sensed that Wright knew more than he was letting on. General, Harold acknowledged with his usual respectful nod. Wright approached slowly, choosing his words carefully. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. About what it would be like to fly. Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Just idle curiosity, sir. Is it? Wright pressed gently. Harold, I've been around pilots my entire career. I know the look in a man's eyes when he's missing the sky. For a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. Wright could see Harold weighing his options, deciding how much truth he could risk sharing. Some dreams are better left buried, General, Harold finally said. Even when they're not really dreams at all? Harold's composure cracked slightly. Sir, I think you might be confusing me with someone else. Wright decided to take a calculated risk. Harold, I know that's not your real name. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Harold's entire posture changed, the submissive janitor facade dropping away to reveal the bearing of a trained warrior. His eyes sharpened, scanning the room for exits and potential threats with practiced efficiency. Who have you been talking to? Harold's voice was no longer that of a humble maintenance worker, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. People who care about preserving the truth, Wright replied carefully. Harold, whatever you did, wherever you served, it doesn't have to stay buried forever. Harold laughed bitterly. You have no idea what you're asking, General. Some things stay buried for good reasons. Asa, try me. Harold looked around the empty briefing room, his gaze lingering on the mission boards and tactical displays. When he spoke again, his voice carried decades of accumulated pain. You want to know who I am? I'm a man who flew missions that never happened, fought in wars that were never declared, and killed people whose deaths were never recorded. I'm someone who gave everything to his country and was rewarded with a new identity and a lifetime of silence. Wright felt the weight of Harold's words. What was your call sign? Harold's eyes flashed with something between anger and nostalgia. That's not information you're cleared for, General. Maybe not officially, Wright conceded. But I think I've earned the right to ask. Harold studied Wright's face for a long moment, as if measuring the man's character and trustworthiness. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. You really want to know? You want to open a door that can never be closed again? Wright nodded without hesitation. Harold straightened to his full height. And for the first time, Wright saw him as he truly was. Not a janitor, but a warrior whose service had cost him everything, including his own identity. "All right, General, you asked for the truth, but understand that once I tell you, both our lives will change forever." Wright felt a chill run down his spine, but his curiosity and respect for the man before him outweighed his caution. "I'm prepared for whatever you have to tell me, Harold." The old man walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where F-16 seconds sat ready for training missions. His reflection in the glass showed a man caught between two worlds: the invisible janitor he had become, and the legendary pilot he had once been. "My call sign," Harold said quietly. Wright felt his knees weaken. Every pilot in the Air Force knew that call sign, even if they didn't know the man who had carried it. Viper 1 was a legend, a ghost story told in pilot lounges around the world. The pilot who had supposedly flown impossible missions, achieved impossible victories, and then simply vanished from all records. "That's not possible," Wright whispered. "Viper 1 is a myth, a story they tell young pilots about the perfect aviator who could fly anything, anywhere, anytime." Harold turned from the window, and Wright saw the truth written in his weathered features. "Myths have to start somewhere, General. And sometimes, the only way to preserve a legend is to bury the man who lived it." Wright staggered backward, his mind reeling. He was standing face to face with a man who was supposed to be a legend, a story, a symbol of everything a pilot could aspire to become. But Harold wasn't a symbol. He was flesh and blood, standing in front of him, holding a mop, and wearing a janitor's uniform. "My God," Wright breathed. "You're really him. You're actually Viper 1. Harold's expression was a mixture of pride and profound sadness. "I was Viper 1. Now I'm just an old man who cleans floors and tries to forget what it felt like to touch the sky." The revelation hit Wright like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about military service, about sacrifice, about what his country asked of its warriors, suddenly seemed inadequate. Here was a man who had given not just his life, but his very identity for his country. And his reward was anonymity and solitude. "Why?" Wright asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold's answer would shatter everything Wright thought he knew about honor, duty, and the true cost of serving in the shadows of national security. Harold moved away from the window and sat heavily in one of the briefing chairs, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. "You want to know why I'm here, General? It's because 30 years ago, I was the best pilot this country ever produced. I could fly anything with wings, and some things that probably shouldn't have been able to get off the ground. But being the best comes with a price." Wright pulled up a chair, sensing that he was about to hear a story that would change his understanding of military service forever. "It started in 1985, Harold began, his eyes focused on something far beyond the briefing room walls. The Cold War was at its peak, and both sides were pushing technology to its limits. The Pentagon had developed aircraft that were so advanced, so revolutionary, that their very existence had to be denied. I was selected to test pilot these machines because I had a combination of skills and psychological profile that made me uniquely qualified." "What kind of aircraft?" Wright asked. Harold's laugh was hollow. "The kind that make the stealth bomber look like a paper airplane. We're talking about machines that could break every known law of physics. Aircraft that incorporated technology decades ahead of anything the public knew existed. Some of it was based on recovered materials that the government will never officially acknowledge." Wright felt his worldview shifting. "Recovered materials? Use your imagination, General. Let's just say that not all advanced technology originated on this planet, and leave it at that." Harold continued his story, painting a picture of a secret world where elite pilots risked their lives testing aircraft that officially didn't exist. For 15 years, he had been Viper 1, the call sign that became synonymous with impossible missions and miraculous survivals. "I flew reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory that no satellite could reach. I piloted experimental fighters in dogfights against aircraft that were equally experimental and equally secret. I conducted rescue operations in countries where the United States officially had no presence. And every single mission, every single flight, was classified at levels so high that even discussing them was considered treason. But you were serving your country. Wright protested. You were a hero. Harold's expression darkened. Heroes get parades, General. Heroes get medals and recognition. What I got was a target painted on my back by everyone who wanted the technology I had access to, and eventually, by my own government. The story Harold told next made Wright's blood run cold. In 1999, Harold had been selected for what was supposed to be his final mission. A deep penetration flight over a hostile nation to retrieve intelligence about their nuclear weapons program. The mission had gone perfectly until his return flight. I was 10 minutes from friendly airspace when I discovered that someone had sabotaged my aircraft. Not the enemy. My own people. Someone in the Pentagon had decided that Viper 1 knew too much, had seen too much, had become too much of a security risk. Harold's voice grew quiet as he described the impossible choice he had faced in those final minutes. He could eject over enemy territory and likely be captured, tortured, and forced to reveal everything he knew about America's most secret programs. Or he could attempt an emergency landing in his damaged aircraft and probably die in the attempt. I chose a third option, Harold said. I crashed the plane in a remote area, made it look like pilot error, and walked away from the wreckage. The pilot's body was never recovered, because there was no body to recover. How did you survive? I had prepared for this possibility years earlier. When you operate in the shadows for as long as I did, you learn to plan for betrayal. I had established a false identity, Harold Mitchell, complete with documentation that would pass casual inspection. Wright was struggling to process the enormity of what he was hearing. But why here? Why work as a janitor on a military base? Harold's answer revealed the depth of his sacrifice. Because despite everything that happened, despite being betrayed by the system I served, I still love this country, and I still love aviation. Working here, even as a janitor, lets me stay close to the world I can never officially be part of again. I get to watch young pilots pursue their dreams, and sometimes, I can offer guidance without revealing who I really am. The way you help the younger airmen, Wright realized. The advice you give them about flying, about handling pressure. It's not just theoretical, is it? Every piece of advice I give comes from experience they couldn't imagine in their worst nightmares, Harold confirmed. But it keeps me connected to the brotherhood I can never officially rejoin. Wright felt overwhelmed by the implications of Harold's story. Here was a man who had given everything for his country. His identity, his recognition, his very existence, and had received nothing in return but the privilege of staying silent about his service. Harold, this is wrong. What happened to you is wrong. You deserve recognition, compensation, acknowledgement of your service. Harold shook his head sadly. General, the technology I was involved with, the missions I flew, they're still classified at levels that will outlive both of us. The programs I worked on are still operational, still secret, still vital to national security. My story can never be told officially, because doing so would compromise operations that are happening right now. Then why tell me? Harold stood and walked back to the window, looking out at the flight line where a new generation of pilots was preparing for training flights. Because you reminded me that some things are worth preserving, even if they can never be officially acknowledged. And because I think you're the kind of man who understands that real heroism isn't about medals and parades. It's about doing what's right, even when no one will ever know you did it. Wright joined Harold at the window, both men watching as an F-16 taxied toward the runway. What happens now? Wright asked. Now? Now you go back to your life, and I go back to mine. You'll retire with honors, and I'll keep mopping floors. But maybe, just maybe, you'll remember that heroism comes in many forms, and that some of the greatest warriors in our nation's history will never appear in any history book. Wright felt a profound sadness, but also a deep respect for the man standing beside him. Harold smiled for the first time since revealing his identity. "You already have, General. You've given me something I haven't had in 30 years. Someone who knows the truth about who I really am. That's more valuable than any medal or recognition." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the F-16 accelerate down the runway and lift into the blue Colorado sky. Wright found himself thinking about all the young pilots he had known over the years, wondering how many had received advice from the legendary Viper 1 without ever knowing it. "Harold," Wright said quietly, "thank you for your service. All of it. Especially the service that can never be acknowledged." Harold nodded, his eyes following the aircraft as it climbed toward the mountains. "Thank you for asking, General. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give a warrior is simply the opportunity to tell his story, even if it can never be shared beyond these walls." As they parted ways that day, Wright carried with him a new understanding of sacrifice and service. He had spent his career believing he understood what it meant to serve his country. But Harold had shown him that there were levels of service that went beyond anything he had imagined. Over the following weeks, Wright found himself spending more time with Harold, learning from a man whose experience encompassed missions and technologies that existed only in the realm of classified legend. Their conversations were always careful, never straying into details that could compromise ongoing operations. But Wright gained insights into leadership, courage, and sacrifice that no military academy could have taught him. When Wright's retirement ceremony arrived, Harold was there, standing at the back of the crowd in his janitor's uniform. Their eyes met across the room, and Wright saw something that moved him to his core: the respect of one warrior for another, transcending rank, recognition, and official acknowledgement. In his retirement speech, Wright spoke about the unsung heroes who served in the shadows, the warriors whose names would never be known, but whose sacrifice made freedom possible. He didn't mention Harold by name, but everyone who knew Wright understood that his words came from a place of profound respect and personal knowledge. After the ceremony, as Wright was leaving the base for the final time, he found a note tucked into his car's windshield. It was written in Harold's distinctive handwriting: "General Wright, thank you for seeing beyond the uniform to the man beneath. Your friendship has given an old pilot the greatest gift of all: the knowledge that his service mattered to someone who understands what service truly means. Fair winds and following seas. H. M. Viper 1. Wright kept that note for the rest of his life. A reminder that heroism isn't always public, sacrifice isn't always recognized, and that some of the greatest warriors in American history might be found in the most unexpected places, serving in the most humble ways. Harold continued working at Peterson Air Force Base for another 5 years before quietly retiring. He moved to a small town in Montana, where he spent his remaining years helping young people understand the fundamentals of flight and the importance of serving something greater than oneself. When Harold passed away in his sleep, at age 78, his funeral was attended by dozens of pilots whose careers had been shaped by advice from an old janitor who understood the sky better than anyone they had ever known. None of them knew they were burying a legend, but all of them knew they were saying goodbye to a man who had profoundly impacted their lives. General Wright delivered the eulogy, speaking about a man of uncommon courage and sacrifice. A warrior who had served his country with distinction in ways that could never be fully revealed. He spoke about the importance of remembering that heroism takes many forms, and that some of the greatest stories of service and sacrifice would never be found in official records. As the ceremony concluded and Harold's casket was lowered into the ground, Wright quietly whispered, "Thank you for your service, Viper 1. Your watch is ended." The legend lived on in the stories shared among pilots, the advice that shaped careers, and the knowledge that somewhere in the shadows of military service, heroes continued to serve without recognition, without fanfare, and without complaint. Harold Mitchell, whose real name died with him, had shown Wright and countless others that true heroism isn't about glory or recognition. but about doing what's right even when no one will ever know you did it.